And there's a lot of friends that we haven't seen in a while. So I'm glad for everyone who's here. I'm excited to be here and excited to dig into what we're going to do now to listen to what God has for us. And the question that I want to start with today is, who is the most important person here? Who's the most important person here? So both humans and animals naturally put themselves into hierarchy of who's in charge and who's underneath and who is not important. You can see that in dogs, you can see it in all kinds of herd animals or social creatures like us, where we naturally just fit into who's highest and who's lowest. And that might seem natural or even sometimes right to us. But God has a way of turning the things that seem natural or right to us totally upside down. As we've been looking at, and we've called On the Road with Jesus. And so this is a part in the Gospels, in the life of Jesus, and specifically we're looking at the book of Mark, where as they start to walk toward Jerusalem, where Jesus is going to be tortured and killed, Jesus takes his followers and they go away from everyone else, and he spends time, and we're given 3 recorded times of when he teaches them about his death, what that means for them as disciples, and he points out their misunderstandings along the way. And so Jesus' death and genuine discipleship is really the focus of these 3 episodes. And discipleship is just following Jesus and trying to become like him. That's what it means to be a disciple. And so last time we looked at the first one in Mark chapter 8, where Jesus began to reveal to his disciples in what I've been calling in my notes the death disclosures. It just seems to work very well. He starts to tell his disciples, we are going to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be tortured, and I'm going to be rejected, and I'm going to die, and then 3 days later, I will rise again. And last time we saw that when Jesus said that, his disciples, particularly Peter, took him aside and started to question it. What are you talking about? That's not going to happen to you. Peter's response warranted a teaching to the disciples about what it meant to be a disciple, namely self-denial. And so we talked about self-denial last time. And we pointed that the disciples are resisting the message of Christ's suffering because it doesn't fit with what they think things should be. They were inputting their own agendas of what should be the case and the things that should happen, and what it should mean for Jesus to be the Messiah. And he has to correct all of that. And so what we see in these episodes are really intimate moments with just Jesus and his closest followers as he's trying to prepare them for what is to come and what it is that they need to know most of all. And so today we're going to look at Mark chapter 9. This is the second of the death disclosures and the lessons about discipleship. And in Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 30, remember they're basically starting all the way up north in their region and they're going all the way down south to Jerusalem. But they went on from there and passed through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. And they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And so the context is that the disciples have just had their confession of who Jesus was, the Messiah, confirmed in what happened in the Transfiguration earlier in chapter 9. They're on the road. Jesus is revealed. His divinity is put right in front of their eyes on the Mount of Transfiguration. But then right after that, they fail to heal a man who has been suffering from terrible seizures because they don't have enough faith. And so we get glimpses of the disciples seeming to understand what's going on. And it seems like maybe they're getting it all and putting it together. And then we see the reality. But they are going south from Caesarea Philippi through Galilee as Jesus is teaching them about his coming suffering. And they come to the house, kind of like the home base in Capernaum, probably Peter's house. And in the house, Jesus teaches them both about their humility, primarily toward each other in the text that we're looking at today, but also their humility to other people outside their immediate circles. And so Mark's main point in our text that we're looking at in these verses seems to be that the disciples do not understand the way of Jesus in light of his cross, and that it means humility, and that it means service toward one another and not vying for greatness. And so what might be going on in the disciples' head is, for one, that they are just doing what all the other rabbis do and talking about who's the greatest, and that was something that we have recorded that was very important to them. But they also might be saying, okay, so Jesus is going to die. Who's going to take over? They don't understand. They want to sort out who should be in charge and maybe who's the best, who's the closest to Jesus, whatever it is. But the main point for us today is that true discipleship, or following and becoming like Christ, requires the humility to serve other people. And already that is completely the opposite of what the disciples had thought. And so we pointed out last time that these three death disclosures in Mark follow the same pattern, where we see, as we just read, Jesus reveals to the disciples that he's about to die. The disciples do not understand. And then Jesus connects his coming suffering and death with a lesson about what that means for them as his disciples. And so first, let's zero in on what Jesus told them about his coming experiences in Jerusalem this time. And I want to take some of the language here and compare it to the first thing that he said to them in chapter 8 and look exactly what it is that Jesus is revealing. And so in particular, verses 30 through 32, as we said, they were passing through Galilee. And it's important to note that he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples. They have retreated from everyone else, the hustle and bustle of healings and all the different signs that were being had and the preaching and things, and he is taking time with them. And he tells them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. And so if you compare what Jesus says here to the first time that he discloses his coming death, there's some interesting differences. So if we look at the first one in Mark chapter 8, also verse 31, it just states that he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And so the first time, Jesus just tells them, we're going to go to Jerusalem. That's where the elders and the priests and the teachers of the law are. We're going to go there, and they're going to reject me. And somehow that's going to end up, and I'm going to die, but I'm going to rise again. And so when we look at the differences as to what's being talked about, really one of the keys here is this phrase that the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. And so the basic facts are still there, that he will be mistreated, he will be killed, and he will rise up after 3 days. And the versions that we're all using, probably most commonly, are about 50-50 on how they split, whether they have used the word delivered or whether they've used the word betrayed. Jesus is going to be given to the people who are about to hurt him. Someone is going to give him to them so that they can do what they're going to do. The elders, the priests, the leaders of the Jewish people in Jerusalem. And so delivered and betrayed both work here. Betrayed is a little bit more specific on the concept. That in particular, that what Jesus is talking about is specifically being betrayed by Judas and him giving Jesus to the leaders. Delivered is a little bit more open-ended, and I think maybe where we should take our minds here, because it just means that someone is giving Jesus into the hands of the people that will hurt him. I think the 2020 version of the New American Standard, I think renders this pretty well, where it says, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him." This is the idea that this is Jesus literally being taken and handed to someone else. Delivered, and in that is the betrayal. And we see the betrayal, and we know the betrayal of Judas and what he does, and that he sells Jesus. But if we look a little bit deeper, I think that there may be more going on than we first recognize. Because notice, as we've been talking about, Jesus will be delivered into their hands. And if you look at this phrase, the Son of Man is going to be given into the hands of man. There's a lot there. The one who is coming to become like them and to save them is the very one that is going to be killed by them. And so the question is, who is handing Jesus over? The first time he talked about his rejection, and now he's saying that he is going to be handed over or delivered. And in the first disclosure, as we talked about in chapter 8, Jesus talks about, he uses the word, this is what must happen. These are the things that must happen according to the divine plan. And I want to suggest that now he may be hinting to the fact that not only may these things happen, or they must happen, but it is by God's involvement that Jesus is going to be handed over. That he will give the Son of Man into the hands of men as their sacrifice, that they will kill themselves. Jesus is being given to the very people that he came to save, and they will be the ones to torture and to murder him. And while this is not stated explicitly, if we dive deep down, I think this is what's going on. That Jesus is saying, yes, I'm going to be rejected, but also God is giving me up to this. This is why I came. This is what has to happen. That Jesus allows himself to be delivered to the very people that he is here to save. And so Mark's placing of this right before the two teachings in the house, surrounded around the children and the little ones of verses 38 through 50, they show that the disciples misunderstand the nature of Christ's kingdom. In light of what they talk about and what we see here with Jesus in talking about his coming death, what is emphasized is that the way of the cross, the way of Jesus that he is trying to get them to see, is through meekness and service to others. That the Son of Man is going to allow himself to be given to these people in order to serve them. And this is the way of those who would follow him as well. He told them before that to follow him means self-denial. If you're going to follow me, you need to take up your cross and deny yourself. And now here we see Jesus says following him in his kingdom means humbling myself for the benefit of others. And so let's see how this sits with the disciples here. And so we talked about verses 30 through 32 that zero in on this. And we see that the way of Jesus here is humility and service. And I really toyed on what was the best word here. Humility, I think meekness also works. But the idea is that I'm lowering myself for other people. That's what Jesus was doing here. The way of Jesus first was denying myself, and now it is the humility and service of others. And so Jesus says this, and they continue on their journey. In verse 33, we come to Capernaum, and they enter the house, and you can just picture it. They're in the house, and everyone's getting settled, and maybe they've just eaten or whatever. And Jesus says, "What were you guys talking about back there?" What were you guys debating is kind of the word here. You guys were really going at it. What were you talking about? And you can see by the disciples' reaction, they understand that this is not something that Jesus would approve of. I don't know if they really understand the larger implications of why, but they know that this is not something that they should be talking about. They had been arguing with each other about who was the most important. Who was the greatest among the inner disciples? And one of the things you see through the Gospels is that as the disciples follow Jesus around, they develop this idea of the insiders and the outsiders, and that we are better than the rest because we are closer to Jesus. And that's one thing that he has to combat against them with. But Jesus addresses this. He already knows what they said. And so there's not any revelation of, well, actually we were talking about this. He asks them, and then he tells them what they need to hear, and that's what brings us to verse 35. He sat down and he called the 12, and that's something you only see Jesus do every so often. Sitting down and calling the people to himself, and it's a very important moment. And he said to them, "If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all." And this is another one of those statements that does not immediately come to mind of, I know exactly what that's talking about. But it's something that they have to sit with and to think about and meditate on. Verse 35 is the core teaching of Jesus to the disciples in this context of verses that we're looking at. This is the nugget. And verses 36 and 37, I think, are the illustration of then what this is going to look like. But here in this nugget, he says, if anyone would be first, and that means if anyone wants to be great, if you want to become something, if you want to achieve, then you do it by being last. What? That is so different than anything that we would ever hear, that they would ever hear from any of their other teachers. If you want to be someone great, if you want to really be great in the kingdom of God, then you need to make yourself last. And being last in this context means putting others before myself. Not working toward my greatness and furthering myself, but looking out for the interests of others and sacrificing myself for them. And so this is another paradox. In Mark chapter 8, there was another paradox. The first one we pointed out, where specifically, after giving the core teaching there in verse 34, of whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. He then gives them this paradox. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. And it's not exactly right on the surface of what that means either. But this is what he tells them. And so greatness in the kingdom of God is not about how great you are and who you are or what you can accomplish. It's about how much we can deny ourselves and love and serve others like Jesus did. In them talking about who would be the greatest, that would be the connection that they would make here. Of true greatness is not about what I can do for myself, it's what I can do for other people. Why is this important? We can read a sentence like this, or maybe the disciples hear it and they kind of think, so what? If I want to be first, I have to be last. I don't really get what that means, and even if so, why does that matter? I want us to see the connection between what Jesus is revealing about his death and why he finds the opportunity to teach this lesson to his disciples. And I think asking the question of why is this important, of verse 35 reveals the connection. And that what he has said in verse 30 is the answer. Where Jesus has talked about what is going to happen to him, in verse 30 through 31, he's teaching his disciples, saying, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he is killed, and after 3 days he will rise. That is why what he says in verse 35 is important. Because that is what he is going to do. He is going to humble himself and give himself for the benefit of others, and his greatness and his victory are only going to come through putting himself last and seemingly being beat by everything else. And so why should I submit to others in humility? And why should I receive those who are less important? And why should I be worried about serving other people? Because that's what Christ did in his sacrifice of himself on the cross. And that's the connection that he wants the apostles to see. That this is my way, and if you're going to follow my way, this is what it means for you, and in particular here in your relationships with each other. You don't need to be fighting about who's the best. You need to be following me and having the humility to serve each other and to see others as more important. And Paul makes a very similar application of this concept in Philippians, and that's what Chip read for us this morning. It's actually striking how similar it is, and maybe this was in Paul's mind when he said this. But in Philippians 2, and starting in verse 3, he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others. Adopt the same attitude as that of Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity, and when he had become as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. And that's what we just said. That this is what Jesus wants the disciples to understand about what he is doing and what that demands of their lives. That if we look and we follow Jesus and we want to emulate him and to become like him, we can see that this is the fallout. That I need to put other people ahead of myself because that's what he did. Not just looking out for what I want, but looking out for the benefit of others. And so Jesus is calling us to get outside of ourselves and to follow him in a life of humble, loving service. And this is something that our world sees as good. Nobody would deny that that's a good thing, but it's something that everybody else should be doing. You should do that, but I don't know if I want to. And when we look at this, it's not about debasing or really even degrading myself, because that's not what Christ did. He humbled himself, but he wasn't of any less value. It's about loving others and making them more important. It's not about how worthless I am. It's about how important other people are. And I think maybe the best word for that is meekness. And it's a word that's kind of phasing out of our language, and so we don't always know exactly what it means, and it's starting to have more of a negative connotation. But really, in the sense that we're talking about, it just means According to Merriam-Webster, a mild, moderate, humble, or submissive quality. And that's how Jesus described himself. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus said, I am meek and lowly in heart. This is who I am. This is what I'm like. And so that's who we should be also. And we all want to be important to some degree. We want people to think that we're important. You know, I want to be blank, and I want to achieve blank, and I want to do this. And I don't want to be bullied and all those kind of things, of course. But Jesus says the values of the kingdom turn all of those expectations upside down. You need to think about other people first. Spend less time thinking about what I want and spend more time thinking about what others want. And I can tell you just from my very limited, immediate experience in our house of how big of a difference this makes. Because one of the things that I struggle with, and that I've talked with some of you about, is that I have this belief that I am entitled to be comfortable all the time. And that doesn't work well when you are responsible for other people, as a father and as a husband. In the times that I hold on to that entitlement of mine, things are a lot more difficult. People are less happy with me. They're not getting their interests met. But the times that I embrace this, not only do things go more smoothly, but I'm happier, as if that's the way that it's supposed to be. And so we can all think about how we can fit this into our lives, and that the values of the kingdom of God are radically different than what our world is teaching us. And who is going to put me last? It's going to have to be me. The Good News Bible actually translates this as, Jesus sat down, he called the 12 disciples, and he said to them, whoever wants to be first must place himself last of all. I'm the one who has to do that. And luckily, Jesus illustrates this point for us. He gives an immediate sort of object lesson to the disciples that then we can take and look at for ourselves. And that's what's going to be in verses 36 and 37. And so Jesus gives the core nugget of teaching there of if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And then it says, and he took a child and he put them in the middle of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And really, to understand what Jesus is illustrating here, we have to understand how they would have originally thought about this. How would they have thought about this great teacher embracing this child in the middle of this discussion with a rabbi and telling them that they should embrace people like that? So their attitude of trying to achieve greatness was very common and even commended in their time and place. Because as we talk about every so often, the world that they lived in was what was considered an honor and shame society. You want to bring honor to yourself, and you want to bring honor to your family, and you want to avoid shame at all costs. And so I want to be as great as possible. And other rabbis would say the same thing. They would say, you need to do whatever your rabbi says and hold them in high esteem, and you need to work for yourself. And this is what we see the Jewish people at the time talking about. And so what Jesus was saying here would be so odd to hear. And then he takes it a step further. And he takes a child and embraces the child, probably one of their children. And he says, whoever receives a child like this receives me. So for them, the idea was sort of like children should be seen and not heard, but it might have even been further than that. And it's a little hard for us to comprehend because within the last century or so, we have put a huge importance on children. And you can see actually some tendencies for people to elevate children too far as to the most important of everything. And that should be tempered a little bit. But in their society, children didn't have much importance at all. And so you can see this later in chapter 10 of Mark, where a similar situation happens, where children are trying to run to Jesus and the disciples get angry about it. Because they thought, this is just silly. Why are you wasting time with this? And so while they should be willing to humble themselves, to accept children like Jesus does, his language here in the context after the point shows that he is using the child more broadly as an example of someone who is seen as powerless and unimportant. It relates to the child, but it also is talking about a whole lot more. And that's where the idea probably of the little ones in the next paragraph talks about. So Jesus is showing us that following in his way of humility manifests in embracing and even serving those who would seem to be the least important among us. And that would have been a very controversial idea. You can see that this idea existed throughout the New Testament. James chapter 2 is an example of a rich person comes in and they want to honor and esteem them. A poor person is there and they say, sit at my feet and get out of the way. So the way of humility is about embracing, welcoming people like that. And that is what this means. This idea of receiving or welcoming, it's like a hospitality terms, and it means accepting someone as a guest. So bringing them in and accepting them and embracing them and then serving them as one would a host. So taking that and connecting it with a child would have been very strange. That I am supposed to accept and embrace a child and honor and serve someone who is like a child. But that is the radical value change that Christ is calling us to. Following Jesus, he calls me to give myself to help others out of love, and to embrace the important and to welcome the insignificant. And we might have different definitions of who fits into that, of who I think is unimportant and who I think is insignificant. It might just be someone who's different from me. Maybe it's somebody who comes in and has a different background than I do. Maybe it's someone that I think is not as smart as I am. Maybe it's someone who doesn't have as much money as I do. Maybe it's someone I just don't like. That is the very person that Christ calls you to humble yourself and to serve. So as I was thinking about illustrations, one really popped into my head. A direct illustration that I have seen in my lifetime is an attitude, particularly in men, that it's beneath them to teach or to care for children. And you can see this as, how many times have I seen important great men stoop down to teach a small child's Bible class? And when you get into the nitty-gritty of why it is, it becomes clear, I need to be doing more important things. And that's a very straightforward illustration of this, and it's attitudes like that that show that this is not what Jesus thought. We can extend that same kind of attitude to other situations. And while reflecting on it, I just kept thinking of questions to sort of examine my motives in different situations as to reveal whether or not I'm embracing this direction from Jesus. And so I thought about, first, who do I spend my time focusing on? Is most of my time focusing on me and what I want and what I think should happen? Another question, are there things or people that I feel are beneath me? I don't need to bother with them. I don't need to help them out. It might be sweeping the floor, whatever it is. That's not really my thing. Another question, do I serve the little ones in that broad sense of those who are insignificant and unimportant? Or do I consider that to be someone else's work? Or do I just serve those who can do something for me? I do things for my friends because I know that they care about me and they'll return the favor, and I enjoy them. Or am I willing to serve other people as well? The attitude that Jesus is pointing out in the disciples would show itself in the fact that maybe I'm in a situation and I think that there are opportunities or tasks or people that are beneath me and not worth my time, or people that I think that I'm better than. And that's what we see in the disciples here. And so when we kind of try to sum all of that up, following Jesus means giving myself for others like he did. And that's not always going to be for my favorite people, and it's not always going to be for the people who it would come most naturally to do so for. But that is what Christ calls me to, because that is what he did. He was given into the hands of the very people that he knew would torture and murder him as a criminal. And he served them. He humbled himself to the point of death on a cross. And so as Jesus is nearing the cross, the disciples are still struggling to understand what the nature of his kingdom is and how things are going to be so very different than anything that they are expecting. As one author, James Edwards, wrote, Jesus speaks of surrendering his life, and the disciples speak of fulfilling theirs. He counts the cost of discipleship, and they count its assets. They have no idea what is coming, and they are recorded in these situations for our benefit so that we can see clearly what it is that Jesus is asking of us. And what he's asking of us is to give of myself for others is more important than me. So we can take this sentence as really the core of the teaching that Jesus is giving us here. That this is what it means to follow him. And this is what he wants the apostles to understand. And then I want you to think back to the first question that I asked. Who's the most important person here? Did you figure it out? The answer is everyone else. The most important person here is everyone else. And that is what we should be striving for. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And that is the way up in the kingdom of God. That is what greatness means. Because that is when we are emulating what the Savior did. That is when we are coming into what it means to be a disciple. So if we correctly understand Jesus' way and how his cross and his victory relate to our everyday lives as disciples, we see that the road that we're following Jesus on leads to holding ourselves in humility with each other, but also in humility with others, as he'll later talk about, and to be willing to serve each other and to serve other people no matter how insignificant they seem. And so first, Jesus calls his followers to self-denial and to willingly enter into the suffering that he experienced. And here he calls them to humble themselves and to be willing to give themselves for the benefit of other people. So as you think about this, for those of you who are disciples, these are things that you can implement and you can examine in your lives and ask yourself questions about where you're falling. But for those who are not already disciples of Christ, who haven't walked on that road with him yet, I want you to understand, think about what Jesus said at the beginning of our lesson, that he was willingly handed over and betrayed into the very hands of the people that he was saving. And he knew that. And yet he went through it anyway. And he humbled himself from the glory that he had as the divine God before the creation. And he came down to be like us, and not only just like us, but a homeless reject, in order to be executed as a criminal so that he could save you. And how are we going to respond to that? How are we going to respond to someone who has emptied themselves so much in order to serve me? And that's what you need to be thinking about. How am I going to respond to that? Now, in a second, Stan is going to lead us in a song, and if you want to respond to that now, if you want to talk about it now, I'm going to be standing up here. But throughout the week, tomorrow, Friday, whatever it is, we are all here for you to help you to do that. If you want to step on the road with us, we're here to assist you. Just let us know whatever we can do as we stand and sing.